Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, April 25th, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about the state of Florida and their brand new congressional map that is now going to be implemented for the next 10 years if the courts do not strike it down, which does not seem likely considering the Florida Supreme Court is a 7-0 Republican majority with 3 appointees coming from Governor Ron DeSantis. Now, putting that aside, what we're looking at here is a congressional map that is very much biased and gerrymandered in favor of the Republican Party. But that's old news. We know that states do gerrymander and that states do go back and forth between congressional maps depending on what the court's decisions are. But in the state of Florida, it's actually a lot more convoluted and a lot more of an infighting thing rather than a Democrat versus Republican issue. The state of Florida issued congressional maps back in February and March that Governor Ron DeSantis ultimately vetoed, saying that he would not take up these new congressional maps. And the Florida legislature, which was at pretty much the mercy of Governor Ron DeSantis, eventually gave up and said that he will draw the maps and they will vote on his proposal. Now, the Democrats, of course, were furious because the original proposal was not nearly as much of a gerrymander as this one actually ended up being. And because of Governor Ron DeSantis, I think we now are in a position where Florida individually strikes out as this very unique state as to how their redistricting process actually went. So this video is dedicated to actually explaining what the hell went on in the state of Florida and giving people a little bit more context as to how we ended up with a map that gives Republicans routinely 20 seats out of the state's 28 congressional districts versus an old map that potentially could have put Democrats and Republicans at equal footing depending on the election year. So this is the map that was just confirmed by the Florida legislature. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, it says the change from the old map is +4 Republican-leaning seats and -3 highly competitive seats. Now, the map prior to this one only added 1 additional Republican seat and did not decrease any competitive seats. All it did was merely add an additional district, considering that Florida has now gained a congressional district because of redistricting and the 2020 census. Now, in drawing a new map, the Florida Republicans had complete and total control over how the map was going to go, but they decided not to gerrymander, not nearly as much at least as this map ended up being. And what you will find is that in comparison to the old map, you're seeing a lot more red. For instance, in the Orlando area, you will find that the Democratic districts have been compacted into 2, removing the competitive nature of the 7th district. It used to be a partisan lean of Democrat +5, now Republican +14. In the Tampa Bay area, what you will find is that the Democrats have been drawn into a singular district, moving all the remaining outskirt districts into practically solid Republican territory. Taking a look at the older maps, what you'll find is that one of these districts was Republican +1, but it was held by a Democrat. Another district, Democrat +12, of course, held by a Democrat. Now, the other 2 Republican districts were, of course, Republican-leaning seats, but you practically removed the Democratic Party's ability at winning any of these districts on the surrounding outsides by compacting them all into Florida's 14th district. In addition, when you look at the older map, the 5th congressional district here has a partisan lean of Democrat +21. In the new map, it has been broken up and now finalized with that incumbent in the 4th congressional district with a partisan lean of Republican +15. And unfortunately for that Democrat, it looks like he's going to have to retire and remove himself from Congress if this map wasn't going to do it already. So the main takeaway here is that the Democratic Party has lost ground in the state of Florida, but this wasn't the first map by far. This was actually the last result for the last resort for the Florida legislature here. And it is unfortunate to see for Democrats, but at the end of the day, I mean, this is just a map that they probably should have been expecting, but Governor Ron DeSantis has really been overstepping his boundaries when it comes down to the checks and balances that are exhibited in the state of Florida. Now, the legislature has always been given the opportunity to draw new congressional boundaries, in addition to state legislative boundaries. And in 2022, they drew new state legislative lines, and Governor Ron DeSantis couldn't do anything. The state constitution did not allow him to veto those maps. Instead, he targeted the congressional districts, which did allow him to veto them. Now, I'm not entirely up to date or educated on the congressional overturning of a veto on these maps. I don't know if the legislature allows for it. I'm assuming that it does, but I am interested to see as to why the Democrats did not join the Republicans in overriding the veto. Potentially, maybe they didn't want to override the veto. The Florida Republicans very much were unwilling to gerrymander Florida more than it already was. And I'll show you exactly what maps they put forth. Of course, there were maps in the past that the Democratic Party would have been opposed to. And I'm sure they've opposed even fairer maps or potentially even more Democratic-leaning maps, which doesn't always mean fair. But the Democrats didn't exactly see Florida as a state that was going to experience such pushback from Governor Ron DeSantis. I mean, there is a significant Republican majority in the state, and honestly, I thought that originally they were going to draw an excessive gerrymander, but after tens and tens of maps that were showing the Democrats and Republicans at around equal footing to the 2020 election, I was quite surprised to see it, but honestly, I was very much in approval. I wasn't in approval because I think the Democratic Party or the Republican Party should be over one another. I was in approval because it maintained the status quo. And given that this state had complete and total control to draw a map like the one Ron DeSantis put forth, I was quite surprised and quite happy to see a status quo map implemented because it meant that representation was at least going to be fairer. You see, when I look at maps such as Illinois or let's say Ohio, where the Democratic Party and the Republican parties are practically stripped entirely of their voices in terms of national and Washington, D.C. representation, it is very unfortunate to see. I see these maps as failures of democracy to a point where you could see 2 Democratic districts in Ohio in a state that routinely gives Democrats 45 to 50% of the vote. I mean, quite literally giving them, 13% representation across the state? You look at Illinois, which Republicans routinely get 40 to 42% of the vote. What you find is that they get 17% in terms of representation. These maps are not democratic and they're not fair looking at congressional redistricting. But it is a policy and it is a strategy implemented by both political parties. Except Florida was different. This was a map that the Florida legislature put forth after Ron DeSantis vetoed or said he was going to veto a map that continued with the 5th congressional district. Now, the interesting thing about this 5th congressional district is that it is abiding by the Voting Rights Act, which protects minority interests, meaning that they ensure a Democrat wins here because minority interests and minority voters almost always elect Democrats. That's just simply how it is. In addition to that, in order to provide a Democratic representative, in order to provide specifically a black representative from the 5th district, you needed to draw in 2 major cities, and you needed to draw it into a safe Democratic region because based off of history and based off of what we know now, Democrats typically nominate minority candidates, and consequently, those districts do have the opportunity to get minority interests recorded, valued, documented, and represented in Washington, D.C. Ron DeSantis was vehemently opposed to this 5th district, and the Republicans were pushing back and saying, no, it actually is required to be there. The new map that has been proposed and passed does not abide by the Voting Rights Act, and it is possible, partially, that the map is struck down. Now, that will come down to the ultimate ruling from, I believe, the Florida Supreme Court or a Republican court in the area. At the end of the day, Florida's map doesn't look like it's likely to be struck down. But it does violate the Voting Rights Act, and the Republicans were trying to at least ensure that there was a Democratic district there, so it could be argued partially that it wasn't violating the Voting Rights Act. The Republicans put forward this map after a lot of contentious debate with Governor Ron DeSantis, and what it resulted in was a solidification of one of the districts here in the Tampa Bay area, and then you found that the surrounding districts were turned into 3 competitive seats. The Democrats still lost that 7th district, but it went from Democrat plus 5 to Democrat plus 9 instead of Democrat plus 5 to Republican plus 14. A 19-point difference is very different than a 14-point difference because there are Democrats in districts that have partisan leans of Republican plus 9. There are very, very few in districts that have partisan leans of Republican plus 14. If you take a look across the state, what you're looking at is actually not much is changing, right? You're looking at the Miami-Dade area and you're finding, okay, actually, the map really isn't changing super substantially. There is maybe some minor changes, Democrat plus 4 to Democrat plus 1, Republican plus 3 to Republican plus 4, but it's honestly not that much. You're talking marginal differences, 1 or 2 points. And quite frankly, Republicans do have the right to draw a map that is more favored towards themselves based off of what we've seen with Democrats in other states and Republicans with other states. It's not hard to see why they did it or that they even did it at all. But to see a map that was, quite frankly, maintaining the status quo, I think the Democratic Party was happy to see it because it meant they weren't going to see a plus 4 gain like we now experience. I mean, this is what 538 calls an extreme bias, and it is 100% true. This new map from the state of Florida is limiting Democratic voices. This new map does take away Democratic representation across the state of Florida. I mean, taking a look at this map, you have 18 Republican-leaning seats. 18. And just 8 Democratic-leaning seats. You take a look back at the 2020 election, Donald Trump only won by 3.3%. In 2016, he won by less than 2 points. In 2018, Republicans won by less than half a point in both the Senate and governor elections. I mean, Florida is by no means a through-and-through Republican state. Republicans just seem to be slightly ahead of the Democrats almost every single time. But that doesn't mean that you should be giving the Republican Party over 67% in terms of total representation. That's where the problem lies. Ultimately, I don't know what's going to happen. I think the courts are going to be very lenient on Ron DeSantis if it gets to the state Supreme Court, but in a map that violates the Voting Rights Act, it is possible that this map is struck down on that accord alone, which means Ron DeSantis could still succeed with a Republican plus 3 map if he just simply implements back Florida's 5th congressional district. That is really the only real concern with this map, and he could still find a gerrymander. Prior to the Florida map being confirmed, the change from the old maps on the national level showed plus 10 Democratic-leaning seats, minus 1 Republican-leaning seats, and minus 7 highly competitive seats, or something around there. Republicans were in the negative, Democrats were in the positive by 10, but then it reduced it. And now Republicans actually are in positive 1, Democrats are ahead by 7, but they previously were ahead by 10. And what you actually look at here is that, yes, the New York maps were strucken down, but will likely be re-implemented. So, I already made a video talking about that. But the point is that the Republicans are now up to where they were, nearly, and the Democrats are starting to lag behind. Previously, the Democrats were on par with where they were, and Republicans were lagged behind. And this new Florida map has really propped them up. I mean, every single district matters. Every single congressional redistricting line and boundary that is now drawn will matter, because a lot of these states are likely going to maintain the status quo. Missouri is just weeks away from confirming their congressional map. They passed their deadline already, but they are likely to maintain the status quo. New York's map is likely to be upheld, and Democrats will make some advancements from there, but the election results have yet to be seen. New Hampshire is likely to maintain the status quo, and Kansas looks like it might actually provide the Democratic Party with an additional district. So, a lot of this is either status quo or marginal gains. When I say New York is this major gain for the Democratic Party, 3 to 4 seats at most, right? Illinois, which was this major gain for the Democratic Party, based off of the current delegation, it's 2 seats, right? Even though it is giving them 17% representation, they didn't start out exactly with a very large amount of representation across congressional boundaries. At the end of the day, what Florida did was essentially shift in a way that we have seen such extreme biases in this map. In fact, it ranks as the second most biased state when it comes down to redistricting. Texas being number 1, number 2 being Florida, then California, then Ohio, Illinois, New York, Georgia. These are all states that I have criticized many, many times for being gerrymanders, for being unfairly benefiting the Republican or Democratic parties, and Florida is now no different. If the old map was enacted, Florida would likely not rank in the top 5. Florida likely would rank well below. And the reason being because the map maintained the status quo. Although Florida was a gerrymander before previously, if you take a look at 2018, Democrats nearly won the majority. Maintaining a map that is similar, nearly identical to the same one that we see here, means that Democrats do have an opportunity for victory. I mean, you take a look at the old map that Florida Republicans actually had proposed. Let's say, for instance, we look at the oldest map that was actually put forth. I'm not sure exactly which one was the most recent one. I'm assuming that it is the Florida House Redistricting Committee, the last one that they ended up proposing. But this map right here, if you take a look at the breakdown, at least to my knowledge, of 2016 presidential election results and 2020, you will find that the 2020 results nearly match what you see right here. What you take a look at here is that you have a state, Florida, in which there are 16 Republican districts, 11 Democratic districts. This would likely be a 16 to 12 Trump to Biden breakdown, or something a little bit else in favor of the GOP. But you take a look at this map and you apply 2016 numbers, you find that Trump and Clinton either are even 14 to 14, or Trump is in the advantage 15 to 13. These maps were fair. They were Republican-leaning, but they were fair relative to what could have been done. And that's the way we look at things in American politics. Nothing is ever going to be perfect. It wasn't an independent commission. It was partisan Republicans drawing boundaries to benefit themselves, yet they did not go to extremes, at least to the extremities that Ron DeSantis went to. And looking at this map that Ron DeSantis has now implemented, it is quite literally going to siphon away Democratic votes, reduce minority representation from the state of Florida, strip minority voices away. And I don't think anything that I have said thus far is a partisan statement. What he did was crack a VRA district. What he did was dilute minority interests. These are not argumentative points. These are factual points that can be exhibited and seen right through the new congressional map. When you break down a majority black district and break it up into 4 Republican districts, you find yourself in a tricky position because it becomes very evident what you are trying to do. This is a map that I think is unfair for the state of Florida, but I am not surprised in the least bit. In fact, I thought this was going to be the first map ever proposed to Florida, and it was going to go in and out. But we will see what happens. I think the courts might end up taking up the case because of the Voting Rights Act, but beyond that, we probably won't see much touched in the state of Florida, and it also could inevitably rise to the Supreme Court and actually end up messing up Democrats in many, many other states should they strike down that provision of the Voting Rights Act, protecting minority interests, protecting minority districts, in a sense, especially given his 6-3 conservative advantage on the national Supreme Court. So this could actually backfire on the Democratic Party. So overall, the state of Florida has gone through a very, very tough time trying to pass maps. There are certain maps such as this where Ron DeSantis says back in February, I'm going to veto it. Says in March, I'm promising I'm going to veto it again. And then actually ends up vetoing it. And then they end up giving up and then just give it to Ron DeSantis and they pass it. And now we'll see what happens. Looking at what we have seen in the state of Florida, what we have seen from the new maps, from the new boundaries, is that Republicans initially did not want to gerrymander the state, but eventually could not stop fighting with Ron DeSantis and said, you know what, we are just going to give up. They could not just, they could not continue this fight, knowing that he was the governor of the state and a very popular one at that. All of those Republican legislatures, should they oppose Ron DeSantis further, could have seen some serious primary threats. They were looking out for their own political ambition first. But voters in Florida did not take too kindly to gerrymandering in previous ballots. We will see what happens. I don't think Ron DeSantis at all is hindered by these new maps passing, but what I do think is that minority interests and, overall democratic principles are jeopardized by the idea of diluting voters from either political party. I've criticized Illinois, I've criticized Ohio, and I'm definitely going to criticize Florida as well. I think it joins in the group, and it is statistically proven to be one of the most biased and gerrymandered maps that we've seen across the nation, but that's honestly not surprising in the least bit. But I am surprised, actually, that it has taken so long to get to this point, knowing that Republicans had such a majority, but I do applaud them for at least trying in the beginning to not mess up with the map too much, at least compared to the old one. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.